Welcome to the Horizons Review. I'm sitting down with Cody once again. We're in person this time. We've got a bottle of Bordeaux sitting across the table from each other. It's pretty nice. And today we're going to talk about Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge. This was Cody's idea, so I'll let him take off and give a little introduction to Polanyi, to personal knowledge, and why we're discussing this today.
Yeah, I thought Polanyi would be good, given that we talked about Newman in a previous podcast. And one of the things that we focused on was Newman's almost prophetic prediction that the role that logic would play in defining understanding and meaning in philosophy in the century after his death. But someone who was around during that time, who was actively responding to both logicists on one end, positives on another, was Michael Polanyi, who himself was not a philosopher, but shaped a significant portion of the conversation around understanding following and preceding World War II through his own work. So the book we'll be discussing today is Personal Knowledge, which was assembled from notes from a series of Gifford lectures that he gave in 1951 to 1952. So Polanyi himself was originally trained as a medical doctor in Hungary, where he graduated in 1914 and I think fought in the Great War. He became a chemist with his PhD in 1916. And at some point, I think in like 1933, he moved to the UK. And during that period, although he was a chemist and he was quite well trained in chemistry, although he says he had some critical encounters with even more brilliant people that kind of strayed him away from chemistry. He became very interested in the nature of science and how it works. And so he developed this whole project trying to understand and tie together certain themes between subjectivism and objectivism, and trying to develop a middle ground in this. And while he's often not read in the philosophy of science today, he did go on to influence a large number of epistemologists, including Thomas Kuhn. So Kuhn, in 1962, published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And at some point in the years following that, Alistair MacIntyre actually wrote an article where he accuses Kuhn of having plagiarized Polanyi, because there are notes from Kuhn saying that Polanyi was ever present in his book while he was writing it. And in the 1969 version of Structure, Kuhn actually does mention Polanyi. So at some point he brought him back in. And so this book on its own is Polanyi trying to wrestle with these issues during the Gifford lectures and discuss how a personal form of knowledge, which we find in subjectivity, can lead us to objective truths, and how, in a sense, not only are these people who think everything is formalization and there are Platonic ideas out there in the world that we can find might be wrong, but also so are the people who say that everything is quite subjective. And he does that via this vision of personal knowledge. So I guess we could talk about kind of setting the framework here. So on one end, he says all of this starts pretty early with Pythagoras. He talks about one vision of science, which you see both in the Greeks, but you see it in Newton, Copernicus, and Descartes, where they have this vision that what you can do is, through the exercise of, say, mathematics or just better tools, you can get outside of human experience to understand what the universe is constructed of. And in fact, on some level, what you can do is you can simply disregard much of human experience as we build up better and better mathematical models or better observational tools. You can almost, in some way, write the human out of it. And for whatever reason, this strikes Polanyi as not only wrong, but very offensive to scientific creativity, and the human process. On the other hand, though, not only do you have people saying that the laws of nature are already present in mathematical objects and kind of out there, uh, you have folks like Ernst Mach, other positivists, empiricists in general, who are just saying that, well, experience is all there is. There's nothing to these mathematical objects in reality. We should refer to everything in a subjective manner. And, these mathematical objects don't mean anything. And he finds this equally offensive and thinks that there's basically a way of getting out of it. And that's more or less the crux of this book, is him discussing this not only in the context of science, but just in terms of human cognition, and then making this kind of ratcheting up from human cognition to social systems at the same time. And in that manner, he ends up defending liberalism, science, and faith, all in kind of one conclusive project.
Yeah, so the first thing you had on the list to discuss was science, like positivism versus realism, subjectivity versus objectivity. Something that struck me reading this today was his example of Copernicus, which almost does feel Kuhnian, the way he talks about Copernicus initially, because he makes this point that actually, if you were being a strict empiricist, like Copernicus was not an improvement over the previous model.
Yeah.
But he doesn't go to the Kuhnian level of like setting up some sort of incommensurability between the dueling theories or anything like that, which that I found really interesting. And like, so what do you think about this particular, like maybe we should anchor it to the Copernican example for a bit, like this particular, the way that Polanyi is trying to resolve this particular conflict.
Yeah, so this is a conflict over basically what is a theory, right? And there's this idea that some people hold naively. I don't think too many people who sit on it for a while. This idea that what a theory is it's kind of a collection of facts that have built towards, like you're constructing a giant arrow towards truth or something like that. Polanyi sees that as wrong. He thinks that while you have facts, what you have kind of overlaying them are things that he calls interpretive frameworks. And these are like heuristics, means for making sense of the facts that you come across. The facts themselves come back into the heuristics, and then it kind of shapes the ways that you then find further means of exploration. So if I'm in one theoretical framework and you're in another theoretical framework, right, we can more or less agree on the structure of the facts, but what matters next is what questions are we going to ask after.
Yeah. I like that he sets up and like this sounds trite when you say it, but he actually does set up some of the grounds for putting some objectivity back into the system when he just says early on, he goes, well, a theory is something other than myself. So it's a map, it's a set of rules, it's something that you can set out, but it exists apart from my fluctuating experience, apart from like what I think about it. And so he's like, so a theory on which I rely, in some ways, if it's actually a theory, it remains unperturbed if my own feelings or experience is somehow fluctuating around that theory. So the theory, I don't think Polanyi would agree with this, but there's an interesting take here that actually the theories themselves can have an objectivity that maybe subjects cannot.
I think he would agree with that in a soft sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in that way, like a theory would be like, later on he talks about how you can describe, I can describe to you how I ride a bicycle or something like that, right?
Right.
But it's fixed in this framework of me actually riding the bicycle. I think he would say a theory is something like that. It's this kind of composite whole of riding the bicycle together. And that's kind of what the theory is. The theory is the thing that sets all the rest of the scientific behavior, fact-finding mission, um, that's kind of subsidiary to the theory itself.
Yeah, I think another important thing that he says too is like, well, theories are, since these formal parts of theories are unaffected by your experience, theories can actually be constructed without regard to your normal experience whatsoever. And he doesn't quite go here, but that does, I think, tell you something about the danger of theoretical knowledge or the danger of theorizing. Is that actually you can decouple this form of reasoning completely from everyday experience if you want to.
Yeah. Although towards the end he does talk about this
Yeah.
in religious context.
Yes.
And says how this can actually be a good thing.
Yeah, I think like we want to revisit this when we
Yeah.
talk later on about the religious doubt and theology stuff.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So towards this point that I was just alluding to about bicycles, and this like parts whole distinction. One of the, I guess, yeah, this is the major theme of the book, is this idea of tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is, he says that it's basically like, he says if you're thinking about a skillful performance, your ability to do something, say cook a meal or even cut up a carrot, to ride a bike. He says that he takes as a clue for his investigation the well-known fact that the aim of a skillful performance is achieved by the observance of a set of rules which are not known as such to the person following them. And so this is for him what he calls the tacit dimension. This is kind of the basis of personal knowledge, is that there are parts to our knowledge ecosystem which, if I call attention to them, I can be aware of them. But when I'm actually doing things out in the world, I'm not all that aware of them. So, let's say, for example, that you're learning to play a piano, right? When you first learn how to play the piano, what you're doing is you're learning all kinds of motor rules for pressing the keys, for getting from one note to the other, so on and so forth. And it's this hyper mechanical, you think about Kahneman's idea of like thinking fast and slow, this very slow procedural thing that you have to do over time. As you get better at playing the piano, eventually this just becomes part of one's rote memory. It's something that you're able to suppress in your consciousness, as you're doing higher order things, such as playing a song, right? When you get better and you're playing a song, what you're thinking about is memorization. What's the next thing that's going to come? How quickly do I need to be moving through this movement in the piece, and so on and so forth. And he says that, in fact, if what you do is, when you're really good, if you go back and you think about those mechanical operations, you'll fall into something like stage fright. So he says that anytime that you're doing something skillful, what you have is a focal awareness. It's an awareness of what you're doing, but then a subsidiary awareness, which is this subsidiary awareness is your awareness of, say, of actually playing the notes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I like that he talks about the role of tradition, and he doesn't talk about it just in regard to the arts.
Yeah.
He talks about it in regard to the sciences as well. He's like, you can teach the propositions of a science. So imagine that I came up and I lectured to you about evolutionary biology or whatever, but I didn't teach you how to go out and do field work on the fossils or how to do field work on living animals or something like that. Like you never got that practical knowledge to go out and do things that might add to the theory, or you didn't learn how to do modern DNA sequencing techniques or something like that. so he talks about the fact that, oh, well, it makes perfect sense that like Western Europe continues to outperform in scientific output because you
Mm-hmm.
have a chain of people who've been working in this field for a long
Yeah.
time. You're passing down a tradition. And I also think it's interesting from the perspective of the decline of certain arts.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm.
Poetry is a good example in the English speaking world. Like, why is quality of poetry
Yeah.
declined? It's sort of like, well, the popular audience for it dried up, but a number of things happen. There's no longer outlets in which you get slowly trained in
Yeah.
writing this thing. Like, there's just MFA programs, and
Yeah.
MFA programs are effectively just trying to lecture at someone about the art of poetry and then just say, go out and do it. Similar thing in fiction. Like, a lot of novelists used to cut their teeth in short story magazines. There's not the same number of intervening steps, for example, for a
Yeah.
television or film writer that there used to be. So people
Mm-hmm.
aren't getting a lot of hands-on practical experience. People are like, why does dialogue sound so fake now in TV? Or what are all these issues? And some people try to like do it from this in of, oh, people don't have experience anymore. And I don't think it's because people lack experience of real world conversation. I think
Right.
it's lacking some sort of tradition that
Oh,
shapes
that's such a
people
good
over
point.
time.
Yeah. 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 That's a great point. Yeah. One of the things he says is that, to learn from another person, um, to learn a historical art requires the acquisition of this tacit knowledge. And basically, it is it is that you have to, first of all, yeah, spend time with another person who's already good at this, and two, basically trust exactly what they're doing. So in Polanyi's framework, these interpretive frameworks like you find in science um, are exactly the same things you just mentioned. Like you would find in art, studying under a master, um, a way of making certain sculptors or
Yeah.
writing dialogue, right?
Yeah.
I remember just because I program and I build agent based models. I remember my first time going to a workshop and we all had to like build a model. I can't remember, some archaeology thing, and I was with another very competent programmer, and we basically built the exact same model. And when I looked at his code, I was just like, "What the hell?"
Yeah.
I was like, "This looks ridiculous." And he looked at mine and he's like, "Why are you doing it that way?" And then I realized, oh, that's just how we do it in our lab,
Yeah.
and that's how they do it in theirs, right?
Yeah. You have that problem in any work field. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what do these acronyms mean? Like, what are the standard like in law? Like, what are the standard terms that like this shop likes in
Yeah.
this type of contract, and et cetera. Um, Something I want to revisit, but I want to sort of put it down on the table. That's something that we need to talk about now. Is we ran into this issue when we discuss Newman
Mm-hmm.
and the essay Native Grammar of Assent, where it's like, all right, so what is the difference between Newman's illative sense
Oh.
and phronesis, anyways? And sort of like what we came up to is like, well, maybe phronesis is a little bit narrower in in Aristotle to being like more about moral action
Mm-hmm.
specifically, whereas the illative sense is quite broader in Newman. And what is the difference exactly between the illative sense and tacit knowledge? I think we can come up with some shade of meaning here, but it does seem to me like two concepts that are so closely aligned with each other that it's
Yeah.
a difficult task to distinguish them for me. And it is interesting because I sincerely doubt that Polanyi ever read the essay in Native Grammar of Assent. Like,
I don't know, maybe.
yeah, like
Because, well, because the
I feel
weird,
like
yeah.
if he had, there might have been like some addressing of the fact that like these two concepts
Yeah.
are so close.
But there is something, maybe he did, because
Yeah,
this weird thing about him talking about like the development of tradition as in a doctrine
yeah,
sounds
but
very Newman-esque.
it's much more believable to me. Like the development of doctrine was a much more widely read book,
Mm.
both in Newman's time and
And even
after
now.
than
Yeah.
the essay. Whereas, like, I think the essay, to some degree, has been forgotten. Like even people I know who've read a lot of Newman often are surprised that that
Yeah.
particular book exists.
Um, yeah. So actually, maybe we can move on to learning and articulation.
Yeah, I think
And
that's a good idea. I just wanted to like plant that out there. This is I think one of the important things that we need to discuss.
yeah, this is a good spot where we can talk about it in a moment. So something that triggered Kyle is that so in this section, there's this region of the book where Polanyi is trying to talk about the means by which human beings learn, and what personal understanding is versus the means by which most animals learn. And he comes up with this, what I find very interesting paradox, where he says, I think that the reason why humans say do better than chimpanzees in cognitive performances, um, I think my friend Erica Cartmill listens to this podcast and she's going to get mad that I said that sentence, so I'm sorry, but uh, is because we have language and they don't. But the paradox is that he says the thing is that the gifts that we provide from speech uh, are actually from non-linguistic advantages. That it isn't merely the ability to verbalize something or discuss them that basically gives us better cognitive abilities, but it's something that the language system interacts with that is helping us out a lot. Um, like, for example, he talks about uh, that in linguistic terms, articulation of meaning is difficult in many cases, if not impossible. And even when I'm talking with myself or I'm talking with you right now, um, the symbolic interpretation of what I'm trying to say is never really fully understood. And he says, when humans are doing that, we're doing oftentimes two things. One is we're fumbling, and so we're constantly trying to correct ourselves. And in that way, we're sharpening whatever our mental objects are or our grasp on a situation. Or two, and I like this one, he says pioneering, which I actually think is something more akin to bullshitting. Uh, he says we're pioneering, which means like as we're talking, we're kind of just like verbally feeling things out with our concepts as a means of improving them. And so he says basically through this stumbling, he reveals what he thinks is a critique of viewing speech packages as carrying correspondences of units of meaning. He's like, it's not the case, if we were just talking and we were saying everything that we mean all the time, there's no way that we would actually ever be reshaping our thoughts via language. Um, and he refers to this guy Humphrey, who says that something very peculiar about humans is our ability to express the exact same things in infinite number of ways. And he says this is something of an indication of our language knowledge maps serving as inference generating procedures. So what we're doing when we're talking is we're sharpening these objects, so on and so forth, rather than simply just sending each other packages of information.
Yeah, I think in defense of pioneering that it's
Yeah.
not just bullshitting. Is that he does have this line later on where he's like, well, we got to commit ourselves to the risk of talking nonsense if we're going to say anything at all.
Yeah.
So I think like you do, like there is a certain amount of like BS, but like it's no longer BS. I think if you're willing to just go, oh, I was like completely wrong. Like I think if you're trying to defend it or trying to squidding someone, then that's appropriately bullshit. But if you're just honestly trying to figure things out, like that could be pioneering.
That's true. I think that's fair. And so that's kind of his view on language. But when I talk about mental objects, like what is it that we're actually sharpening when we're talking with each other? So that's language is in the domain of an articulate intelligence. So those things that we can articulate, that we can talk about, oftentimes they touch and alter systems which we can't really always talk about. But he talks about three different kinds of inarticulate intelligences that kind of map on to what was happening during that period of time in reinforcement learning. So he says there are three forms of animal intelligences that he can kind of very clearly see. So the first one is the learning of tricks. And this maps to classical conditioning. So cases in which I have a rat in a room and the rat learns that, oh, if I click this lever, I'm going to get some food, right? It makes what is more or less like a sensory motor connection to this sensation produces this thing. And B.F. Skinner had all kinds of different examples where he could, for example, get rats to like spin around 3 times. He had pigeons that could do all kinds of tricks to trigger a release of food and so forth. And he says this is for the animal the invention of a means-end relationship. So the animal is contriving something. It's able to say, okay, if I do this, this happens. But it's not learning signs. This is different from operant conditioning, where the animal, say, learns that when this light turns on, I can do this thing to get a reward. So it's venturing into not merely inventing a means end relationship, but getting a symbolic association with something. And then the last one is what he calls understanding. And this was associated with, after Skinner, there was a scientist named Tolman, who basically found that if you just let a mouse run around in an empty maze, you don't give it any reward or anything like that. So it shouldn't basically be doing any kind of conditioning. And you later drop food into the maze, the mouse will know exactly where to run, despite it being a maze, as if it had memorized it without any kind of conditioning. And Polanyi says this is understanding because, unlike the other cases where the animal is either inventing or observing, here what it's doing is it's from the get-go interpreting. It's basically learning, or it has learned a map of the thing that it's manipulating. And so it's doing what it needs to do via the manipulation of mental objects. And in all these cases, he says there's the development of heuristics, which are your ways of knowing. So contriving, observing, understanding. And he says that these are irreversible. So you pick up your means of understanding the world, say that's your means of being conditioned with some sensory motor association if you're a mouse clicking a lever. But while that's irreversible, you can't go from observation back to your understanding. What is reversible are the routines that you develop from it, such that in the same way, if I have a scientific theory, it's unlikely that I'm going to immediately tear down the theory without, like, say, the association of tearing down all the facts with it. And this irreversibility is what he says, he says this is basically the domain of our tacit knowledge, this thing that we can't really access, but is nevertheless generating new patterns in our behavior.
Yeah, so you mentioned that this part triggered me. I wouldn't say I just think that there's something important that's getting missed in this part, which is not just the dimension of language, but the dimension of ability to manipulate the world through like the human body. Like I think like that's a very important source of human knowledge that is maybe easy to skip over because The example I brought up to Cody earlier was like, well, I said like you could completely convince me that humpback whales have a highly sophisticated language that's capable of communicating complex ideas.
Yeah.
And it would still be shocking to me if humpback whales could achieve human levels of cognition and understanding of the world, because both just by the accident of existing in the water and that they have flippers instead of hands and like a number of other things, like they don't have the ability to sort of experiment
Yeah.
and manipulate the world in the same way that humans do. And like even to the degree that like it wouldn't shock me if there are distinct advantages that maybe elephants have over whales in cognition, because they have trunks and use tools and are able to bury their dead and like various other strange things that being able to directly manipulate the physical world allows you to develop a culture about, and you have to start reasoning about it in order to do it. And this is also worth talking about because this is of course one of the big arguments about whether AI can ever have human-like sentience is, well, what does it mean that to have sentience that isn't embodied on one level? And then it's like, do you actually have that sort of knowledge of manipulating the physical world, which is in some ways it's the first thing that it's something that children learn even before language, right? It's like, oh, I have these arms. Oh, these arms belong to me. Oh, these arms can be manipulated to do things out in the world. I can grasp. I can manipulate. I can move. And language usually comes later than that.
Yeah, what Dreyfus calls random thrashing about, I think he says. And he also says that language is associated with this random. You know who else made this association between object manipulability and like weird facets of evolution was E.O. Wilson. When he wrote Sociobiology, there's like a throwaway line where he's like, it's kind of weird that like the ability to manipulate is associated with altruism. And he talks about not just humans, but the case you just brought up with elephants.
Yeah.
And also ants.
Yeah.
Where he says, they have pincers, and he's like, I should think about that more. And then he never comes back to it.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought about with like his close connection between complex cognition and the existence of language, it almost sets up an evolutionary paradox. Because it's like, okay, well, the machinery of complex language, like humans have this incredible vocal machinery that other great apes do not have. But what is the purpose of that machinery outside needing to communicate complex ideas? I mean, like you can come up with plenty of evolutionary just so stories, but like the simplest thing that I would think is like, well, already humans had this sort of like knowledge capacity and we're developing finer vocal machinery in order to communicate more ideas more fluently. But that sort of like pushes me back more into like actually maybe the fact that we have hands and thumbs and have two of them free all the time is something that's very important to our intelligence.
So there are some theories out there. So first of all, I had a paper on human vocal abilities that, yes, it is a just so story and it's a little bit cringe.
But no, I mean, evolution advances by just so stories.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not bullshitting. I'm pioneering. But so in my paper, basically what we say is that the ability to form complex vocal articulation is to copy animals. Because we hunt them and we have to
I
mimic
remember
them.
reading this.
Yeah. But in line with the more sophisticated hypothesis that you just said is some people have called attention to this. It's called the technological pedagogy hypothesis. The idea that if you think about the fact that language is kind of a program, right, in terms of its like grammar procedures, right, that you could think about language not just in terms of the ability to provide utterances, but in terms of its so it's not incompatible with my theory, but in terms of its grammar structure, is basically so that I can transmit a set of complex instructions to you. And this might also, another just so story, explain why so many people are right-handed. It's because if I'm trying to learn some kind of motor task from someone near me, and I'm trying to copy them, it would be best if I'm copying on the same side.
Yeah.
Say in the context of like making a stone tool or a basket or cooking or something like that. Like if we're both right-handed, it's just that much easier to download your information.
Yeah, an important thing that just happened is that like sometimes when you're pioneering, you realize that you're just copying something that you've heard before. Because I do indeed, when you started bringing it up, remember this technological hypothesis for the
Mm.
evolution of language. And I was like, okay, yeah, I've actually have read something about this before, and I thought I was having some sort of original thought for once, but it wasn't.
I like this use of pioneering. I'm no longer going to say I'm bullshitting.
Yeah.
I'm going to say I'm a brave pioneer. Um, and so what's really important here is in the context of Toulmin, right? What Toulmin was trying to say is that in understanding is the most important level for Polanyi. So you can forget about the symbolic and the sensory motor and just think about understanding. In Tolman's case, what he was trying to show was that the rats were making mental maps of the places they were in and then using those mental maps to do whatever tasks they were doing. And you can think about that in the same way that you think about a theory. A theory guides you in a way towards solving other different problems or any other framework, right? So these are for Polanyi in the same way that the rat has an image of the maze in its mind, which is very hard for the rat to change. Once it has it set, updating that is going to be really hard, or it's going to trigger some form of surprise in the animal. He's saying that this is how humans generally mentally operate via these inaccessible, hard to change maps, but they are kind of socially conditioned, right? And everything else kind of follows from these heuristic maps. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting to me that he didn't think about this aspect of like the human bowel plan like being
Mm-hmm.
part of our advantage and rationality, because when he's talking about tacit knowledge, so many of the examples he's using are actually about physical manipulation in the world.
Yeah.
So he uses the example of cycling. Like actually no one has a theory of how to stay balanced on a bicycle, but
Mm-hmm.
like there is this thing like, yeah, you're like turning the wheel to like change the curve and do
Yeah.
this, and like, but no one's thinking about that. You just gain this tacit knowledge about manipulating your way through the world,
Yeah.
and you don't communicate it in that sense at all. So like there are these ways in which like there are certain sorts of tacit knowledge that you can only gain because you have certain physical capacities. Like I am never going to gain the tacit knowledge about how to catch, like how to be an excellent outfielder in baseball, because I don't really have depth perception. So I'm
Yeah.
just always going to suck at it. And that's a form of like that is a form of like practical knowledge that is like forever going to be alien to me.
Yeah. I think this is a good point, and I'll just add more to the evolutionary point that you made, specifically on motor use and tools. Polanyi was really a good philosopher of machines and teleology. He has a lot of papers on what's the difference between a machine and a living system. He talks about how he's skeptical that say computers are actually computing, that actually it's the human computer loop that's computing because we're giving it kind of an end directed goal.
Yeah.
But this point about tools, right? That
Yeah. That's interesting in light of LLMs.
yes, yeah, it totally is. But this point about tools is neat because and part of my research program is trying to understand cognitive representations. What is that? What are we doing when we're thinking about tools? And I think for Polanyi, he would talk about these mental objects as tools in the exact same way that he would talk about, say, bicycles, so on and so forth. So in the world of representations, right, you can think about, a level one representation being like an encoding of the environment on something, right? If I press into a piece of dough, right, it technically has a representation of my finger.
Right.
On the other hand, there's a representation that is like a mental image that, say, a animal can recognize faces or something. But then there's almost this, and David Krakauer at the Santa Fe Institute talks about this, there's almost this third level of representation, which is the ability to manipulate that representation in your head as if it is an object or a tool of itself. And this connects to some stuff on dreams and sleep. So REM sleep, for example, is very important for motor learning. It's not good for, say, memorizing things. It's not good for declarative knowledge. So in college, when I was studying for an exam, I would specifically set my alarm clock to wake me up every 90 minutes before the exam when I was crunching, because I had the hypothesis that if I didn't go into REM sleep, it would increase my declarative memory. Yeah, I don't know if that was true, but I did do well in college.
I'm deeply skeptical that that actually did anything for you, like rather than just being young and being able to deal with really messed up sleep.
I agree. I think it gave me stress lines in my forehead is mostly what that did. But the point is that this is something that's known. And so actually one of the ways in which you can identify, say, these R3 representations, these manipulable tools, is looking for the equivalent of like rapid eye movement sleep in animals, right? That they are actively simulating their world of representations via dreaming. And so I think your connection to tools makes a really deep point about what representations are and our ability to kind of, use something as a tool. And this gets into his philosophy of machinery, where he's saying, basically all these things are tools to some extent.
Yeah, and it's not that cetaceans like exactly lack tools, because they definitely do manipulate some things in their environment and play with things and do some other things that you could say are at least analogous to tool use. But this is something where I don't want to make this theory too strong, because then it would turn cetacean intelligence into something much more shocking than I think it needs to be.
Well, I mean, we have like bottlenose dolphins that use sponges.
No, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like, there are things analogous to like some people, like, I don't want to get into the debate about what constitutes tool use, which I know people love to have. Like, do you have to additionally shape the object in order for it to count as a tool or not? Like,
no.
I dislike that entire realm of discussion.
But the other thing is, and this gets into kind of our next section, which is something he talked about a lot, is conviviality.
Yeah. One
of the things that, this is going to sound bad, one of the things that we use as tools are each other, right? In our social systems. Yeah. like there are studies that show, let's say I'm sitting at one end of a table, right? And a child is at one of a table, and it has to, say, reach out and grab some kind of an object, right? Based on like eye tracking data, the child, if the object is too far, you can tell that the child doesn't even register something that's far away of it as a potential goal, right? Because it's not going to be able to reach across the table to grab that thing. But if there is a cooperative child on the other end of the table who can help it, it registers both the other person and that thing that they can't reach kind of as a tool in themselves, that we're able to use other people in a way to do what we need to do. And he says this about children where, and he's referring to Piaget, so this is older stuff, where when kids are playing together, sometimes they'll lose this sense of self. They'll start to kind of understand each other as a unit. I don't know how much I really believe this, because a lot of the Piaget stuff has been thrown off. But this is kind of his idea of conviviality, the idea of this.
Yeah, I don't know. I actually like kind of believe this as
Oh,
like a like someone who was a child who was very good at manipulating other children through play.
yeah,
Like it wouldn't shock me that
yeah.
this is like a normal thing.
You were also reading as a 1-year-old though, so
I like the something that made me think about like using people as tools is like I don't think that's necessarily even a bad thing.
No, it's
like
not.
like
Yeah,
some
yeah,
people like I actually made this point sort of in passing in the post that I wrote as a blog post on the Substack about relationships need transactions.
Oh yeah.
Is like sometimes this is like most obvious in marriages, but it also sometimes happens in friendships.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there's something going on where it looks very, very unfair from the outside. Like the most typical example you can think of historically is a woman who's married to a guy who is a great artist or academic of some sort. And it just seems like she's just like constantly pouring into him so that he's able to do his work. But like often when you look at these people, like they usually seem to be quite happy. Like that's actually how they're developing meaning in their life is like serving this person that they know is doing something.
They're acting as a unit.
Yeah. That there's actually like the transaction that's going on there is actually something that both parties are getting something out of and feel is fair. And like that's probably like the good use of a person as a tool is where the person is actually getting fulfillment out of it versus I'm not a Kantian, but like this particular phrasing is useful is like treating the person as a means and not an end.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think this is a good point. Right. It's also, I think about this a lot with the disappearance of secretaries. Like that used to be like a very, you would have like this, if you're like a man CEO or something like that, you'd have this almost like female shadow of yourself who understands your routine and your schedule really well. And as you said, oftentimes this was just people's wives. I mean, Charles Darwin famously put a lot of work on his family.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why. I mean, like the idea that this is like someone's wife is like, I mean, like that's why famously so many people have affairs with their secretaries.
Yeah,
even today, secretaries still exist.
Yeah,
and I indeed have worked in organizations where they exist and people are having affairs with them. So, I mean, they're, if Kierkegaard was correct that to instruct a woman in religion, there's something erotic. It's like to run a man's agenda, there is something erotic.
Yeah, but I do think that there has been like this degradation of the secretary position in modern life, where it's like a woman who sits at the front desk and answers phone calls, and it's like actually this was like
it's very, very subtle. Like it's like being a good butler, or being a good valet. It's like being able to be the person who actually understands how to be a servant and do a very good job of it and be excellent at it. Is actually something quite subtle. And some people are very happy doing that, can find a lot of meaning in that kind of role.
Of course. And so this,
honestly, I mean, I sorry, it's just like something I get stuck on is that when people try to demean these types of roles, it really, and say that no one should be in that position. Like, I'm sorry, some of the most exalted positions in society are effectively service roles. Lawyers are a service role. Like judges might be the exception, but like judges, I think actually ideally are servants of the law and servants of society. Like they're serving something, they're serving an abstraction at that point. But like lawyers who work normally, like you're in a service. You're in the service industry as a lawyer, like, and no one thinks of that as like a down market, embarrassing thing to do. doctors are in the service industry, and that's not a down market
Yeah,
embarrassing thing to do. So like, why is it embarrassing to be a good maid or a good butler, or a good secretary? It is. It is. Sorry, this is like something that just drives me slightly crazy. Is when people treat this as like something embarrassing, and it's good that it's some of these rules are falling out of society. I just don't think that's true.
I agree. I think part of it is that like we have there's kind of this drive for everyone to like write their own story now.
Yeah.
And like there's this sense that, oh, if I'm someone's butler, or
Yeah,
like if
someone
I'm
else
someone's
is writing my
secretary,
story.
yeah.
But
Like,
I don't know if I most jobs that you have, someone's writing your story for you to some degree. But
no, right.
but yeah, so the conviviality stuff, I think
Mm-hmm.
the important thing is like I think we should be explicit about this is conviviality is the system by which tacit knowledge actually can be propagated.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of a university, like so the classical idea of a university is like it's all about supporting this sort of conviviality
Mm-hmm.
between scholars such that they're able to reach maximum output, not just transmit output to students, though that is one part of it, but also like that conviviality that creates a structure for intellectual output as well is very important. And whether or not the current university fulfills that or not, I mean, maybe if we wanted to revisit Newman at some point, we could read the idea of a university.
Yeah, this goes in line with it. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think this is like the important thing to think about when it comes to Polanyi's discussion of conviviality. It's like there has to be some structure in which
Yeah.
tacit knowledge is propagated.
Yeah. So what's really cool about conviviality, I think this is really, I think, like the high point of the book, because he starts discussing his social vision and how things work together. Because if you recall, as we talked about at the beginning, he's trying to draw this fine line between, say, a completely subjective world and a completely objective world, right? And how does he do this? By appealing to everyone's personal knowledge that they kind of develop on their own, and I guess through the sense of masters. And so he has this really amazing line where he kind of says, well, if you read my framework, you might ask yourself, doesn't that mean we should just like believe whatever we believe and state that everything is just subjective? And he goes, correct. Um, yes. He says something like, he literally says, so be it.
Yeah.
And it must be this way. But he says the way that you do this is by aligning people to the same interpretive frameworks, the same traditions, such that you can make progress on the same sorts of things. He has another really good essay called Beyond Nihilism, where he tries to defend the scientific method, not by appealing strictly to its rationality, but by saying, well, look at the fruits of its labor.
Yeah. Yeah, this idea of like I this is something I need to sit with more, is this idea of like whether or not you can just own the idea that like traditions can provide some sort of objectivity. Like there is something slightly disturbing to me about that. Like to bring up, it's very interesting to me because like when MacIntyre talks about this in I think it's in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, he doesn't, to my memory, it's been 15 plus years since I've read the book. I don't remember him bringing up Polanyi. But like, even though I think this is not what he's trying to do, like in that book, like he really does, I feel, set up incommensurability between rival traditions in that book. And that and like, yeah, they can sort of like, he's always such a Hegelian thinker. It's like they actually can be synthesized, but that synthesis in some ways in MacIntyre feels like yet another incommensurable tradition. It just like happens to be that there's a genius that comes along. Like he puts Aquinas in this role, which I actually find very unconvincing.
That's right.
But yeah, the idea, like I can buy the idea that you only actually arrive at knowledge within the context of some tradition. But I think to be too blasé about like, that's the only way that you know things and you can't quite step outside of it at any point does lead to me to incommensurability. It's a strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis for all of human thought.
Well, you have to remember the book that came after this was Kuhn's Structure, right?
Yeah,
where incommensurability was made explicit. Yeah. It was a separate project. I don't agree with MacIntyre that it was completely plagiaristic.
Yeah. No. That's what I said. Yeah, I did. Yeah, bring this up about Kuhn earlier. Like, I do think that Kuhn, like, just owning the idea of incommensurability is something quite different than what Polanyi is doing in this book. And that's one of the reasons I've never found Kuhn satisfying. Like, I actually just even my own reading of the history of science, and then there's this funny thing where people sometimes claim that plate tectonics gets accepted relatively rapidly in the 60s and 70s throughout the geological community. And one hypothesis that people have floated for how quickly the idea takes over and there's relatively little resistance after a short period of time is actually Kuhn was in the water and everyone was afraid to end up on the wrong end of the paradigm shift. But if that's true and that's possible, there's actually not incommensurability in quite as strict of a way as you would think from reading Kuhn.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Has someone written on that, or is that you?
No, I don't know if anyone's written a very detailed take on this, but it has been something that I've seen a few different authors, like I can't remember who now, float in passing. When I was an undergrad, I was really interested in these type of questions, and I was mostly interested in them in the context of the history of historical geology. So I'd never really looked as much into the plate tectonics question exactly. But this is an idea that is not my idea. It is an idea that I've encountered in other writers. But as far as someone actually like trying to write up a very detailed account or to prove this thesis that Kuhn was in the water enough, like it's believable to me because my experience with geologists is, which might be surprising because what a lot of people think about geologists is that they actually might be the second most philosophically literate group of scientists outside of physicists. Like a lot of them do engage with philosophy of science. Whereas there are a lot of like, even though biology would think would be richer for philosophy of science, I've met far more biologists who are just entirely dismissive of philosophy of science as something that can actually provide knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, well, think about like Gould and Eldritch, right? Yeah. Like those guys were definitely citing Kuhn.
Yeah.
But
then as another example, as an example from someone who's more rooted in biology, there's Dawkins, who actually like just says explicitly that philosophy of science is nonsense.
Yeah, well, he's wrong. And and E.O. Wilson did the same thing. Yeah. I think that sociobiology would have been a completely fine book and anthropologists would have ignored it had he not in the last chapter said this will replace philosophy. Possibly one of the most ignorant statements of all time, but that is really what I think made people angry about sociobiology.
Yeah, Wilson is always a funny case to me because he's like a man out of time.
Yeah,
like he's a hardcore, like thoroughgoing British empiricist removed 50 to 100 years
from Alabama.
From their peak.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I say that with complete admiration.
No, same. I'm saying this is actually a good thing. Yeah. This is actually a really good thing. But so back to conviviality. we can think about it in terms of the development of scientific programs, but Polanyi was also known for being a liberal. But and several people have brought this up. I'm thinking there's a good book by this guy R.T. Allen called Beyond Liberalism: Hayek versus Polanyi, and I think the author gets Hayek wrong, but it's one of the best descriptions of Polanyi's social vision, which is that Polanyi himself could like marginally be called a liberal. He was more of like, you can use these terms interchangeably, like a conservative liberal or a liberal conservative who thinks that the liberal project was good, but that all of the things which we use to defend liberalism will ultimately lead to its downfall. So, for example, he says that in defense of tradition, if it is true that what we have are these interpretive frameworks that we all share and we're trying to develop on them in a cultural setting, in a common law setting, in a scientific setting. What you need is a system where, one, the respect for tradition is held by everyone in that system, and two, people have the same underlying frameworks for meaning. And to your point about universities, um, one of these things is that learners kind of require a trust in their teachers. They have to be able to listen to people that they're learning from older people, from their professors, so on and so forth. Like, it can't just be youth perpetually generating new knowledge. Like, Polanyi is oftentimes called a Burkean or compared to Burke for this reason, his kind of deference to tradition above all other things. And, his view was that we can only have a liberal society so long as we have liberals in it.
Yeah.
Everyone has to basically get with the project. Your kind of liberal norms don't come for free. You need people who get with the program. And I love that he talks about this in terms of truth and love, because John Paul II's whole social philosophy was called the Society of Truth and Love. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, this brings, yeah, this kind of like is a good place, I think, to bridge into his discussion of doubt.
mm. Oh,
Because
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
because one of the things that he talks about doubt is he's like, okay, so this is a particular philosophical project that arose at a certain point of time, and then by Locke you start to come up with the idea that actually doubt is going to lead to sort of
Mm-hmm.
tolerance and all these good positive externalities, and this continues outward into the utilitarians. But I feel like it reaches its endpoint where doubt can actually provide any sort of tolerance with Popper
Mm-hmm.
and the
Yeah,
paradox of
yeah.
tolerance, because in a way, like, there's a complete justification. Well, if you believe that doubt is the source of tolerance, that anyone who doesn't engage in sort of the empiricist or
Mm-hmm.
Cartesian project of doubt is going to be fundamentally intolerant, and you can just sort of go after them, and like, so, and that's sort of the end of
Yeah.
the doubt as a engine of tolerance. And then that and if doubt is no longer providing that, and he also talks about like the doubt removed a lot of meaning from the world as
Yeah.
well. So if doubt is robbed the world of meaning, not provided it with anything useful, and it's not actually providing the sort of tolerance which at least is allowing us to live together without going at each other's throats, then what is the purpose of this
What is
technology
it doing for us?
at this
Yeah.
point?
Yeah, he really goes hard on specifically John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell in the section on doubt. He has this like incredible claim where he says, or this incredible quote where he says, to claim that you strictly refrain from believing anything that could be disproved is merely to cloak your own will to believe your beliefs behind a false pretense of self-critical severity. Um,
I mean, in even though those aren't the people that he's talking about, in Polanyi's defense, if I were his age and I sort of came to intellectual maturity in a world when people were still taking logical positivism seriously,
Yeah.
I would also be a complete asshole about
Well,
it.
it's interesting because like it's funny that he doesn't name him here. The person who he's really responding to is Karl Popper.
Yeah.
Who was also a liberal, and they famously did not get along. They had like the same ultimate project that they wanted, which was like a nice liberal open society.
No.
But well, as like you're saying, Popper was saying, oh, well, we can, do it on these pretenses. Polanyi just went full conservative, and he's like, no, 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 no. Like we have to appeal to our irrational means and tradition,
Yeah.
and we can't just use these heuristics to guide our way out of things.
Yeah. I mean, like, this is something that's has a very deep political valence at this point of time, because like
Mm-hmm.
one of the probably maybe the big political question of definitely the past 10 years and maybe the past 20 years is liberalism something that's evenly distributed?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you actually need some sort of culture to have liberal?
Yeah.
No, I guess it really, like, we really have to put it back to 2003 at the very least as a controlling question. Like, the idea that the big question of the Iraq War is like whether or not you were going to turn Iraq into a
Yeah.
liberal democracy.
Are we going to do?
And
to
then
them,
everything else was like kind of like downhill of like that particular question for the last 20 plus years of politics.
Yeah.
So like that is a big question. Like what does it mean to have liberalism apart from some sort of like culture that values liberal values?
No, precisely. I mean, and this is something that Polanyi agreed with Hayek on, because if you read Hayek, a lot of people have this image of Friedrich Hayek as being this like, laissez-faire liberalism, always good. There's a famous story where after the fall of communism, the Czech Republic called up Hayek and said, okay, how do we restructure our economy to be more like, America's? And the famous apocryphal story is Hayek said, okay, well, just repeat the last 300 years of English history and then call me back.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the funny things is, to me, it's like even Hayek's most read book, which is Road to Serfdom, it's very hard for me to see how someone would read Road to Serfdom and come away with the impression that he was just a simple, naive libertarian.
Yeah. Yeah. He was, he's similar to Polanyi, believed in, the importance of implicit. Well, Hayek was a Polanyi boo. He got like the term spontaneous order, polycentricity. He got all these things from Polanyi. He was a big fan. And so he's working explicitly with kind of a Polanyi's framework when he was right. Although Road to Serfdom was a little bit earlier than his later works, Law, Legislation, and Liberty, where I think he makes kind of the cultural critique a little bit more explicit. But this kind of social project, he talks about like, this is why things like rituals are important. It kind of gets everyone into the same program, knowing that they're, going for the same goals, so on and so forth, to complete things. That really what matters a lot are these irrelevant cultural actions, at least for getting people in the same program. And in that way, you really can read Polanyi as a conservative rather than as the kinds of liberals that we generally see around today, like the
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this in regards, like, once again, to the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there would be the take, like, this is like the Plato Polanyi fusion is like you're allowed to have fiction and the arts, but like fiction that attacks the normal societal institutions, like, just has to be strictly banned.
Yeah.
Right, that would be the
yeah.
it's like the idea that oh, we're going to like make all this fiction about how like it is actually deeply lame to care about your high school football team.
Mm-hmm.
Like actually the Beach Boys Be True to Your School is the height of art
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it
yeah,
teaches
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it enforces the idea that you need to engage in this social ritual.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, right. Although he does say there's like a massive place for dissent, right?
No,
He says
no,
like,
no. I'm not. Yeah, yeah. I'm taking this way farther
yeah,
to make a joke
yeah,
here,
of course, of course, yeah.
but there is something to this idea that like actually, if you were if you're taking this idea seriously, like one of the good purposes of art is to reinforce social ritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that is a
totally.
legitimate good purpose of art, and I think lots of I you know plenty of the theories of the purpose of Athenian tragedy or comedy like underline this, or there are people
Mm-hmm.
who read the history plays of Shakespeare in the same way as like reinforcing like a certain sort of cultural ritual value.
Yeah, that's true.
Um, so like it's to me very obvious that you can have this purpose that some people would say is counter to art and actually produce great
Yeah,
art
yeah.
because of it rather than in spite of it.
No, precisely. Well, I mean, like, this point about dissent, right? Is that when you do dissent, you should do so in a way that what you're doing is you're taking on the role of the teacher. You're pointing something out about the consensus, not necessarily deconstructing, but in the same way that I test a hypothesis or something. I'm trying to alter what's going on, and this connection to art is really, really neat because Polanyi was trying to create like this like odd mixture of tradition plus subjectivism. And at the same time, what you have emerging in France is this kind of post structuralism that's very individual based. It says that, our subjectivity is true, therefore anything goes. And Polanyi saying our subjectivity is true, therefore we have to prevent it from being anything goes. Um, and I think that those have like different those have different valences for like the normative value of aesthetics specifically.
Yeah. So he actually comes up with this idea near the idea end of the discussion of conviviality, which is actually one of the more philosophically difficult points that he's making in
Mm-hmm.
this, which is all right, well, if we sort of accept like this sort of version of truth, which is grounded in some sort of social network, um, we have to like redefine. So snow is white is true if and only if snow is white would be the classic definition. But he's like, actually, no, we need to revise this definition. Uh, I shall say that snow is white is true if and only if I believe
Mm-hmm.
that snow is white. And that's like, yeah, that makes sense based on his theory, but that's also a disturbing
Yeah.
statement because the corollary of that is like the things that I believe are true.
Mm-hmm. Right. Again, he's trying. Again, he's trying to say that objectivity is real, ground it in the subjectivity, but via this gradualist framework. Yeah, maybe he fails at it.
Yeah, that's what I
Like, yeah,
what
yeah.
I've wondered is like, does he actually succeed at providing all the space? And we had the same question about Newman.
Yeah.
Does Newman, in providing all this proper space for the actual subjectivity of human cognition, actually still preserve any sense left of objectivity?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it comes back to Dante in Paradise, when Dante is getting grilled by Saint Peter, and he asks him, "Well, how do you think that?" Peter asks, "Why do you think God is real?" And Dante says, "Well, after you died, everyone wrote down all this stuff, and we called it the Bible, and I kind of
Mm.
believe that." And Peter says, "Well, that's really not enough, because didn't human beings write that with their subjective
Yeah.
views on what happened?" And then Dante eventually says, "Well, all right, the truth is, I have a weaker argument, but that I believe more, which is I see the church in the world and I think it works."
Yeah.
And I think Polanyi is doing the same thing that Dante did.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like I always find this very, very unsatisfying.
Yeah, it
That
is.
I sometimes come to the end of like a really good argument like this, and I go, "All right," but in the end, this only seems to quite be squared if I can also accept like some form of dialetheism.
Yeah,
And I'm like, do I really want to take that next step? Like, do
yeah.
I want a paraconsistent logic
Yeah,
in order to make sense of the world?
yeah,
And like maybe the answer is you do.
yeah.
You do need that. But it's a very hard river for me to cross.
Yeah. Um, so I guess, and there are other topics I want to talk on, but kind of one that we have just going through the linear order of the book is Polanyi's view of religious doubt
Yeah.
and theology, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but like it's almost unfair to call it religious doubt
Mm-hmm.
because it's only in reference to Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's very concerned, and this is something that's interesting. So, as a biographical note, Cody and I were talking about this earlier. So Polanyi was born to a Hungarian Jewish family, but he converted at a relatively young age in his early 20s to Christianity. And so all of his concern about faith is in reaction to what he sees as the Christian view of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And in his reading of Christian faith is always making claims that you can't quite empirically back, even though there's a sense in which it's sinful to doubt the empirical claims of Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
that it is actually like it's a dogma of Christianity that you're never going to fulfill it. Like there's this Kierkegaardian sense in which, oh yeah, I'm not a Christian, I'm only like becoming a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Um
Mm-hmm.
and that even goes like deep down to the level of faith. And I do think this is a real distinction. Even if it's hard to distinguish the illative sense from tacit knowledge, I think this is a very real distinction from Newman.
Yeah.
Because Newman's concept of assent kind of crowds out doubt. Like if you're really assenting to something, you're crowding out doubt. Which,
Mm-hmm.
whereas for Polanyi, some continuing
You just
issue of doubt is actually not just expected, but actually a requirement for Christian belief.
Yeah, he has this weird, almost Newman-esque argument that's not the Newman of assent, but Newman of development of doctrine, where he thinks that continuous doubt improves the Christian doctrine in some way, and one's personal, not just doctrine, but one's personal.
Because he makes this point. He's like, when he talks about doubt, he's like, so like doubt has like really undermined like the ability of people to naively believe in Christianity, but actually that's a good thing because now we can like
now we have
go
better,
back and we can make Christianity better in the face of doubt. And it's interesting to me that he doesn't bring this up because like the one area in which this idea is plausible at all to me is Darwin has removed a certain naivety. naivete about the theology of creation
Mm-hmm.
that could exist before Darwin,
Right.
but can no longer exist in the post-Darwinian world. Like
Mm-hmm.
you actually have to you actually have to confront the existence of millions of years of death before
Yeah.
anatomically modern humans, or you have to confront the idea that, like, it's Darwin famously with like the parasitic wasps is like, I cannot believe that a benevolent God would have
Yeah.
created such creatures.
Yeah. Yeah, he does this thing where he basically brackets off uh the development of one's Christian beliefs from the development of one's like empirical
Yeah.
beliefs. Like, earlier we talked about heuristics and heuristic development and like, the Tolman
Yeah.
maps of the maze. And it seems that his view of Christianity is something like that. He calls it an indwelling in the sense that it's this framework that allows you to make sense of all kinds of different things that necessarily isn't just your empirical framework, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, like I kind of want to revisit like this issue of evolution. So like
Yeah.
I have a friend mutual on Twitter who's theologian, very, very smart, young earth creationist.
Okay.
And I don't want to like say who this person is because I don't want to call them out. Because like there's possibly people who'd be like, yeah, I want to go after like someone who has that particular position. Um, but like one of his reasons for being YEC is the idea that doing otherwise actually undermines traditional natural law.
Sure, right.
And my take on this is that actually it doesn't undermine natural law at all. It undermines to me what I think is like a series of like bad just so stories that natural law developed, where you look out into nature and try to read moral lessons into the behavior of animals.
Yeah, sure.
And you can no longer do that with modern biology and with Darwin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Darwin 100% plunges you into nature red in tooth and claw.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
you don't get to skirt around this. You don't get to look at you don't get to create these like nice medieval fables about how the behavior of animals like reveals some truth about Christ, or the relationship of Christ's virgin, or like the pelicans plucking at its breast, like all these sort of like wonderful little tales that people tell. And it's like, but to me these actually have nothing to do with natural law at all. Like there's no connection between the idea that certain things are true and morally true from like from the existence of human nature and from the relation that human beings have to the world, to the idea that these things have to be reflected in the operations of creatures. And in fact, from a Christian point of view, you would even expect otherwise. Like to me, this would actually be an undermining of Christianity. Like if you looked out in the world and saw that the world was somehow non-fallen, like what is the role of man as
what are we doing?
What is the role of man as mediator to creation? Like what is the purpose? Like what are we offering back up to God anyhow?
Yeah.
Like from that point of view.
Yeah.
So that's why I find, like, to me it's very easy to believe what Polanyi is saying here is that if Christianity is true, and if doubt had its like historical purpose, then it would have to leave Christianity stronger. And to me, the most obvious example is probably Darwinism removing some of the naivete out of natural law theory.
Yeah, this is also in his discussion of miracles, right?
Yeah.
Where he's like, if we could explain these things, like if science did have a bearing on them, like they'd be completely meaningless for us.
Yeah.
Like our empirical view actually should not have a bearing in this way on the development of our theological views, right?
Does he? I can't remember. Does? Yes, he does actually bring up briefly Tertullian. he doesn't give the obvious quote of like, the I believe uh, because it's absurd or because it's nonsense.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but he does like, mention like, yeah, Tertullian seems to have even enjoyed the startling
Yeah,
paradoxes
right.
of his faith. And he does like because he actually compares this, which is very funny to me, but you
Yeah.
see it all the time. He's like, physicists seem to enjoy the apparent absurdities that their modern theories
Mm-hmm.
create. And like every single physicist who's ever like soy jacked about quantum mechanics
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, exactly.
has done
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that he also puts this. He doesn't say this himself regarding miracles, but he does think that this, or you can make this argument at least for the case of historically for like the gospel writers, right? So like Jesus raising people from the dead wasn't that shocking, but Lazarus was shocking because he had been dead for
Yeah,
enough
yeah,
days that like yeah, 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 yeah.
it is a funny idea. And like I've never found this explanation convincing, because when I've like tried to dig down and find a source for it, like I've never found a good source backing this up. And some people are like, well, it's because first century Jews believed that the soul kind of lingered
They had like
around
4 days or something.
lingered
Yeah,
around the body for a certain number of days and
yeah,
then, went off to Sheol.
yeah.
And I just
Is it not true?
I can't find the like I've never like it probably exists out there somewhere, and like someone's gonna go, you're a moron and you didn't look in this obvious place for it.
Okay.
But like I've never found anyone who said this like actually give the citation. And it is
Okay.
possible that like if you go back far enough, like someone actually gives the citation.
Yeah.
But like everyone just seems to be repeating this as a story that they've heard in seminary or something at some point.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
no one remembers what the actual like source, please.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're pulling a source, please, right now. Yeah. So the story is that Lazarus had been dead for a certain amount of time, where like his soul could not have been recalled except for by anyone but God, and that's why Lazarus was more shocking than all the other miracles that Jesus performed during that. Well, you could also argue that it's because he was like entering Jerusalem, so there's more people. But
no, there obviously has to be some explanation, but to me, it's also really funny that then they're and like once again, I think it's because of like the gospel writers. Like I think they are writing history.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are really trying to account for something that they believe actually happened. But they're not just doing straight history. So it's like, they mention like, so upon the resurrection that many arose from the tombs and were seen. People in Jerusalem can tell you about this. But they don't treat that as something that was blowing people's minds. So it was because that Lazarus already came back. They're just like, oh yeah, of course.
Of course, dead people would be around. Yeah.
But yeah, that has always been something funny to me. Is like there's this funny nature of the Gospels that exists even in Luke, which is the most grounded and historical sounding of the Gospels, where at times the narrative is given like all this loving detail that like is very psychologically evocative, and sometimes it has like this very sparse thing that's going on where it almost feels formulaic. And I don't know what the answer to that is, and it's like bringing us off the topic of Polanyi. Well, it is something I think about a lot.
I'll add to your point about drawing lessons from nature and stuff, and this kind of parsing off our kind of religious interpretive framework from our empirical framework. He has this great quote. He says, "The book of Genesis and its great pictorial illustrations, like the frescoes of Michelangelo, remain a far more intelligent account of the nature and origin of the universe the representation of the world is a chance collocation of atoms, which means he's not denying, the fact that the Big Bang happened and this collocation. Right. He says, for the biblical cosmology continues to express, however inadequately, the significance of the fact that the world exists and that man has emerged from it. And so he's saying there's like immense true value in this thing that doesn't deny per se the empirical thing, but provides an almost realer account of it. I mean, Jordan Peterson would probably love this quote, but
yeah, it makes me wonder how he would feel about someone like expressing theories of like a meta historical fall.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who don't understand what this is, so there's an entire family of theories in Christianity which are actually quite ancient regarding the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, of taking place on some dimension or some level that is other than the creation that we all now know. So it's
like
very
Adam and Eve got pulled into this.
Yeah. Like it's very easy for us to go, oh, in our post-Darwinian world, to go, okay, so human beings evolved, and then like maybe Adam and Eve were off in some special creation and then got dropped into this. Because there is this weird element to the Adam and Eve story where it's like Adam and Eve get expelled from the garden. They have Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Cain goes off to wander in the wilderness and meets a wife.
And there's people out there.
Yeah. Like, so what is
his cousins?
What what is going on here? So this is why, like, even just on the evidence of the Bible without Darwinism, people were already dwelling on these meta historical ideas about like what the fall means. Like, is there some other universe? Is the creation that we know all downhill of man falling at some other point? Like another theory would be like, oh, there's the fall of man, and now creation as we know it comes into being, and man sort of gets recreated in the evolutionary sense, and then is stuck doing this thing of like, once again, naming the animals and like trying to offer them back up to God, but in this world that is now marked by the fact that death is part of it. So yeah, it is interesting to me because like Polanyi, the funny thing about this whole chapter is it's marked by someone who clearly has a deep sense of faith, but someone who actually doesn't seem that interested in what you would think of as traditional theological questions.
You know what I think he's doing? I think he's answering Pascal.
Okay.
So, Pascal presented his wager where he says, I'm giving you the reasons like why you should believe in God, not empirical reasons.
Right.
And people later responded to Pascal and they said, okay, I've accepted your wager. Now, how do I believe?
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't know. Just hang out with religious people a bunch.
Yeah, this is kind of what I said to a friend of yours this weekend.
Okay.
So she was talking about like thinking of converting to Orthodoxy, and she's like, all right, well, I don't think I have like the right idea of heaven or like this other stuff. And I was like, okay, so this is something that I actually told a friend of mine a long time ago who was struggling with this. And to me, it's, well, if you can go into church and recite the creed, not with like even the level of like, I believe this in terms of like, I like have Newman style assent to every proposition here, but you can say this in terms of, I intend to try my best to believe these things, or I am struggling to believe these things. Cause I think there is a sense like, I don't think this is a dodge. There are going to be friends of mine who I went to seminary with who are going to criticize me for saying this, but I actually think that this is a very authentic way to believe something, is to say that you are trying to struggle with this and you've accepted that you are going to be putting in effort
Yeah, sure.
to believe these particular propositions, and that is an authentic way to believe the things, because you are in fact saying, no, I'm entering into this tradition by doing this. And that is something that I do find lacking in Polanyi's discussion of tradition. Like, he doesn't really, in Conviviality, he doesn't really discuss like how you enter into a tradition, because there's this element where it's like, so I would say there's two major theories that people have in modernity about how do you enter into a tradition. So there's one, which is the highly subjective, maybe anthropological theory of how you enter into a tradition, which is basically that you're born to it.
Yeah, right.
And you're given all these things, and actually you can never really move between the tradition that you're born into to some other tradition.
Sure.
That is a very strong idea.
Yeah, you just have to be in the right lab.
Yeah, that is a very strong intuition that a lot of people seem to have. They think all conversions are somehow fake.
Yeah.
And then there's another idea of how you enter into a tradition, which is the Guinanian version. No, like I do think this is a real theory. The Guinanian version of how you enter into a tradition, which is you have to find a tradition that has some sort of chain of initiatory practice that reaches you back to the origin of that tradition, and it still exists, and you can go and get initiated into that tradition by a master of that tradition. And that is one of the, even though most Guinanians now are not Muslims, like that's why that's a big reason why Guinan becomes a Sufi Muslim, is that he thinks that that's actually an area where there's still an extant initiatory tradition, because he thinks it no longer exists in Christianity. So I'm saying,
I see, right.
Yeah. So like, I would say those are like sort of the two theories that are generally on offer for how you enter into tradition.
Yeah.
Is either the you're born to it or the initiatory theory.
I think both are probably right.
And I think that both are right, but I actually do think this is the other area. I do think there's a third method. And the third method by which you enter into a tradition is you actually do read or reason your way into accepting that tradition.
Yeah,
like there is no formal initiation by some sort of master who is able to
show you
bring
the right things.
Show you all the ropes, but like you actually can go on a rational sense. No, I accept this particular tradition. I'm going to make sense of it. I'm going to try it on. So there's a long running blog / intellectual project that I really, really like, from a guy who moved to Japan, became a Japanese citizen, and it's basically like how he's been putting on Shintoism and trying it out as a pretty empirically minded Anglo for some amount of time. And that's fascinating, because I actually do think that's a legitimate way to enter into tradition, is actually in this experimental mode.
This is more Newman-esque.
You can find yourself to the place where you're like, no, I'm willing to try this on. And it can be for various reasons. And this is something else I told your friend, was like, I think sometimes people who are highly intellectual and highly honest with themselves get too worked up about the idea of like, am I doing this thing for the right reason? And sometimes you're pulled into things for relatively superficial reasons, but once you're pulled in for those superficial reasons, they turn out to be quite deep. And sometimes those reasons aren't, and sometimes when you reflect on those reasons, they turned out to not be that superficial in the first place. That was just sort of your subjective feeling. Like you admired so much what you were seeing in this tradition that you felt that whatever sort of position that you had vis-a-vis it was insufficient
Yeah.
to the
Because
you're
outside of the tradition.
thing.
You're outside of the tradition, so you would have that viewpoint to begin with, right?
Yeah. Well, if you respected it enough to want to enter into it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think your first two systems, one is that you're born into it, and the other one is that you find a tradition with like a chain of practice. I think that's in line with Polanyi.
Yeah.
And I think 3 is more Newman-esque in terms of, identifying, finding the reasons why, working it out.
Yeah.
That seems more active than the other two.
But I just, I think that's real.
I will say, towards Polanyi, it's odd. He like drops his biggest bombs like in this section on religious doubt, and specifically like how do you enter into a tradition. It is brought up in this kind of last bit on religious doubt. He says that the power of a framework composed of words and gestures to elicit religious comprehension in a receptive person will depend partly on the non-religious significance of its elements. And he's saying the framework has to impress an unbeliever in the first place by the appeal made by dogma, narratives, morality, and ritual exercise before the religion is comprehended by them.
So this is years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I knew a guy who was a PhD student in philosophy at UC Boulder.
Mm-hmm.
And his ambition as a philosopher, which I love, because like I like it when people have great ambitions for like what they're going to do in their field, was we will be the generation that finally like conclusively disproves the existence of God.
Okay.
But this same guy
kind of based
said what he admired most about Christianity was the fact that it seemed to make certain people who accepted it to be much more intelligent than they would be otherwise. That actually accepting this entire framework like opened up people's minds and made them to be something at a much higher level than they would have been otherwise. It's kind of like what C.S. Lewis has to say about Pilgrim's Progress or Paradise Lost. So, like, there's someone who might not have been a great artist, but they were inspired by this story to actually create a great work of art.
This is present in John Paul II's book, Person and Act. This is his concept of transcendence. Like, he's like, very few things actually push you to rise above the situations of your circumstance. And, and for better or better, religion is one of them,
Yeah, and like, I think that one of the ways in which I judge big ideas is ever since this guy told me that he felt that way about Christianity, like I started thinking about that. And I realized a lot of big ideas are like that. They make big ideas make the person smarter who embraces them. And then there are some big ideas that do the opposite. Yeah. And that is sort of how I judge big ideas ever since, is like, okay, do the people I know who embrace this idea seem to get better or worse?
Yeah. Do you get better by being a rationalist?
Yeah. Well, the idea that I always come up with, like, seems to make people who are otherwise very intelligent worse when they take it very, very seriously, is conspiratorial anti-Semitism. Like, if you actually believe there's some sort of like, and so it's really funny to me, because I think you have to be, I hate this term, a high decoupler to even entertain this idea in the first place. But like the idea that's like, most people will go, of course conspiratorial anti-Semitism makes you an idiot because it's just obviously false. But then you, like, if you do create the distance where you go like, all right, why would someone agree? Why would someone come to this idea in the first place? Like, what are the things that make them this attractive? And you go, okay, like, I can kind of understand how someone arrives at this, but then you look at the results of embracing it. And I've actually seen this happen to people who I knew who then later on embraced this idea. They actually become dumber.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyhow, I think this is a good place for us to like start summing up and then maybe revisiting the question of comparing him to Newman again. So, do you want to start doing that?
Yeah. So I think, kind of to sum it up, again, Polanyi's coming at this point that we have subjective and objective views in the world, that the objective is in some way real. It's something that's difficult to articulate. It's something that can be cultivated, not necessarily always described, and not necessarily always manipulated, but that we can maintain our connection to real things, to productive culture, productive institutions, etc., by this shared system of conviviality. This is something that other philosophers like um, another Catholic, Ivan Illich, talks about in his book, Tools for Conviviality. He says, how should we structure a society such that we can have more convivial institutions? And he puts his head on. But I love that the way that Polanyi closes his Gifford lectures and this book is by bringing it back to an attack on Bertrand Russell and this point about doubt. He says, if you take doubt seriously, we should just kind of raise people in dark rooms, have them come up with their ideas, and then see what happens. And he's like, what you'll find is that if you just push doubt to its limits, he's saying, I'm only saying what this principle would demand. If we actually listen to people like Popper and in this case Russell, what you'll end up with is people who have sat there and denied the role that personal knowledge plays in developing objectivity, and you'll just create, I think he says, imbeciles. You'll create imbeciles in the dark.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, he actually talks about this earlier when he's talking about the chimpanzees raised in the dark and how they can't recognize it takes them a long time to even visually recognize objects that should be of great importance to them.
Yeah. He takes a Russell quote and he says,
which, by the way, seems especially evil to me that you would
even do that experiment.
Yeah.
Well, we always say like what the social sciences need is the forbidden experiment, which is like raise the kid on the island and see what happens. It's like that's like the last goal of social sciences is who will let me do this. Anyways, hopefully no one listened to that. But so Russell has this quote where he says, rational doubt alone, if it could be generated, would suffice to introduce the millennium. And he goes, actually, Russell's previously quoted sentence should read, the acceptance of rational beliefs such as my own would suffice to introduce the millennium.
Yeah.
And he says, if you look at like the rise of Marxism and Nazism, he said, what did they do? He said they rejected Western tradition and its rationalism, which now relies on tradition, and it turned those against it.
Yeah.
And he's like, basically, what you're saying is, while you use this to critique Marxists and the Nazis, they just did exactly what you're asking for.
Yeah. The Nazis were in fact very explicit about this. Like, Goebbels is like, no, we're asking you to do horrible things that have no moral justification, but they will become moral in the end.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And they had their reasons.
Like, you have to become the hard men who will do these immoral things in order to usher in the new age.
Precisely. Yeah.
The Russell quote also just made me think about, like, once again, it feels like such a trite insight, but the problem is that it's true. It's like how much of Western secular morality is downstream of Christianity to the degree that, like, Russell is even using the Christian metaphor of we're ushering in the millennium.
Yeah, right, yeah. But that's the majority of the book. If you could sum it up, it's that we have these inaccessible beliefs these inaccessible beliefs are they develop these interpretive frameworks. Interpretive frameworks are what guide skill development, but they're also what guide our higher order beliefs. And the ways of maintaining them are in the context of tradition. I think that this connection between unspecifiable beliefs, inarticulability, and so on and so forth go back to an earlier conversation that we had about Cardinal John Henry Newman and his idea of the illative sense, which is this, it refers almost to this automaticity of thought that is not, it's not quite logical deducing. It's more like Bayesian inference generation, where it's
Yeah.
like I expose myself to this thing and thus I, simulate the world as it would be if this thing were true.
Yeah. It's a convergence of everything you've been exposed to in
Yeah.
the illative sense is like, and then you're able to, yeah. Because I was thinking a lot about this today. It's like, all right, because this is something I've thought about in the past, and I keep coming around to the same answer, but it isn't entirely satisfying, which is what is really the difference between tacit knowledge and the illative sense. And tacit knowledge in Polanyi, I feel like, is very task bound.
Oh, sure.
So we come back to the bicycle example. It's like there's nothing generalizable about how you've learned to balance yourself on a bicycle. There's very little, like there is a ladder here. There's very little that's generalizable about, oh, you've gained the tacit knowledge to paint in a realistic fashion because you've entered into some apprenticeship and you've copied the masters and you've done all this work and you now know how to do this. And then there's the tacit knowledge that you gain from being part of a tradition, which is quite broader, but still kind of operates in this kind of sense. Whereas, like, you do get the impression that actually Newman's illative sense is able to operate in a broader way than the Polanyi's tacit knowledge. Because to go back to what we were talking about how do you enter into a tradition, and you were saying that sort of the two options that I say are the major options on offer in our society, which is you're either born to it or you enter into this Guananian initiatory chain. You're like, yeah, that fits with Polanyi. But like this third example where you can kind of like read and reason your way into accepting a tradition, like it's much harder to fit with Polanyi's account, but it fits perfectly within Newman's account of the illative sense, that actually you could just sort of like sit around and accumulate knowledge sitting in your study and come to this like firm, for Newman it has to be a firm conviction, but come across to this firm conviction that these things are true and that this tradition is worthy of entering into.
Polanyi strikes me as like almost nihilistic about the ability to change one's core
that's
beliefs.
why I find, even though he seems to reject it in what he says, like I find it very hard to come out of Polanyi and not come across like this idea of like strict incommensurability between rival traditions or rival settings.
Yeah, where they come together, I guess, is this role of the inarticulable, right? And what communication does. Like Newman says that articulation is for trying to bring about notions of these inarticulable assents. And Polanyi talks about communication as kind of, this, what was the word, pioneering, etc., of core beliefs. Those kind of connect in that way. But I think they very much diverge in that, Polanyi wouldn't say that, he would say you can cultivate interpretive frameworks via the lens of altering a tradition and making sure that that tradition is kept alive. But an illative sense is something, per Newman, that you can cultivate in a person.
Yeah. And like this is to say that in the end, like I do think there fantastic ideas and lines in this book. But even as many problems as I have, and we discuss these when we discuss Newman's, as I have with Newman's vision of human knowledge, I find it to be overall a more attractive vision than Polanyi's.
Yeah.
Because I have a very hard time finding a way to escape the incommensurability question in Polanyi. And like, why does this bother me? Okay, well, it bothers me because I feel like if incommensurability is really real, there is no such thing as rationality anymore.
Right.
It's the same thing as like a strong version of Sapir-Whorf.
Yeah,
which does, I think, it's almost implicit in his view of language.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. Yeah.
It is really hard to escape.
Yeah. Yeah, he's much more strongly subjective,
right,
than I think any other traditionalist or person trying to defend the project of science would be, right? Or truth, right? He's someone who does believe in truth, but I think in this book he doesn't actually get to like a good defense of humans coming to grasp at it.
Yeah.
Except, via some consequentialist.
Yeah, and it is so funny to me because he is very, very clear earlier in the book when he's like, oh, so the theory of relativity, which people who have like this instrumental, subjective view of science tend to think of as a triumph of their theory, is actually not that at all. Like, actually, it is very empirically grounded. It does reflect reality. It has some objective truth to it.
He's taking
but
it
then
for
when
granted.
you move forward into his argument, like, you get farther away from that, paradoxically.
Yeah, it's fascinating because early in the book he brings up Einstein and Einstein's discovery of relativity. And actually what he says is that, like, it's not connected to any tradition or gradual change in science, but to acts of intuition on the part of Einstein dating back to when he was like 16 years old.
Yeah.
And that's not really articulated in the rest of the book.
Yeah.
What that actually meant for what was Einstein doing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because he brings up that some of the traditional experiments that people say, oh, these prove relativity, actually have very little to do with relativity. Like, he brings up the idea of Michelson-Morley, which is very funny to me, because there is an entire chain of non-academic physicists out there. You can find them on the internet. They still exist, who still believe in the luminiferous ether.
Oh, really?
yeah. There are still ether theorists out there, and I think they don't have a terrible argument.
Yeah.
Certain empirical things more back up the luminiferous ether than they do relativity.
Yeah.
But the problem is that, like, I think relativity just explains more things, and the mathematical model is much more elegant. Anyways, we don't need to. But it's very interesting to me that he's so adamant early on about this question in regards to the theory of relativity.
Yeah,
and then for me, the rest of the book, I feel like, ultimately ends up undermining those particular insights.
Yeah. I think he proffers like a good defense of tradition and, like, why we ought to listen to teachers. And,
well,
he's a conservative. Like,
he provides a good defense for the necessity of tradition, but not the objectivity of tradition.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
that's it.
Because it's very hard to understand, like, once again, from the perspective of the idea that there may be only two ways that you enter into a tradition, which is to be born into it or to be initiated into it, like a master and apprentice scenario. How then you could ever assess rival traditions?
Yeah, it seems kind of nihilistic.
Yeah,
which would explain a lot of the work coming after him, right? Like
Yeah.
Kuhn and others who
Yeah. Like
probably read him and were like, ooh,
yeah,
you know?
yeah, it's funny. Yeah, the Kuhn thing is really funny to me because I first read Kuhn, I think when I was 19 or something like that.
Mhm.
And I was like, yeah, this is obviously true.
Yeah.
And I think I just sort of like naively accepted it from the fact that like actually a lot of what he says about the history of science is very compelling.
Right.
And I didn't really dwell too much on the downstream consequences of his epistemology that's inherent in the structure of scientific revolutions.
Yeah.
And so I became more skeptical of his account over time.
Yeah.
Because of this. But yeah, I think we're starting to circle at this point.
I will say it's funny that one person who responds to Kuhn is Popper.
Right.
And the idea of commensurability. And what does he call his paper? He calls it the myth of the framework.
Yeah.
None of these guys ever used the term framework, but you know who did was Polanyi.
Yeah.
Like, I think these guys were just kind of shadow boxing with each other while holding a mutual respect that, you know, if I destroy the other guy, it might undermine the liberal project, but I actually do have a lot of problems with him.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to hide it as I'm attacking all these other people in the meantime.
Yeah. It's an interesting theory. But yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap up this particular discussion. So Cody and I will be back hopefully much sooner than the last couple of times. We're going to be talking about referencing back to this, some of Benedict XVI's view of like the human person and human reason that are illustrated in his sermons on the book of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And that will probably be our next podcast, hopefully within a week or two. So thank you for joining us for this episode of the Horizons Review, and hopefully we'll be back within a week or two. Bye.